Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Manitoba Agriculture Crop Talk webinar. If you have any questions during the presentations today, please type them into the Q&A icon on your Zoom toolbar, and we'll get to them at the end of each presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording. Thank you.
Thanks, Laurie. I'd like to welcome everyone to the July 31st edition of Crop Talk. And seems like the growing season is going by fast. A lot of the crops starting to get a little bit of a tinge of changing color. We're definitely seeing that in peas and fall rye and winter wheat, and even in some of the early seeded cereal crops. So we're getting closer and closer. And I see as I'm driving around more and more combines up in front of the sheds and guys working on their harvesting equipment. So we're definitely getting closer to seeing what the crop is like out there. With that, I thought been getting a lot of calls and a lot of questions during conversations regarding the canola crop, and thought it would be a good idea to spend some time this week talking about the 24 canola crop and maybe discussing a few of the things that I guess might be going on, things that we can watch for as the crop matures in, and maybe discuss a few things that have been happening with the crop already. So with that, I got Sonia Wilson to come on, our oilseed specialist, and she's going to talk about some of the stresses the canola crop has been facing, whether it be the weather or some of the diseases that we can definitely be looking out for. Conditions have been fairly good for disease right now. And then after that, John Vlasky will take over, and John's going to give us an update on some of the late season insects to watch for and what he's been seeing in some of the trap counts and where we sit, maybe some of the reports he's been getting on some of the insects that might be either building in numbers or maybe starting to cause some issues out there. So with that, I will turn it over to Sonia, and we'll get started with the looking at the 24 canola crop.
Great. Thanks, Lionel. I will share my screen here. Okay. Perfect. Yeah, so I'm just going to give a brief overview here of some of the weather challenges and just disease challenges that we've been seeing in the canola crop, especially in June and July here, and how to identify them and some of the effects. So I will head on in. So let's talk a bit about two of the main kind of weather, or we call them abiotic stresses, kind of that you're seeing potentially in your canola. And of course, very obvious, especially this spring, was excess moisture stress, or having kind of waterlogging or flooding in fields, right, has been a real challenge, particularly this spring, but then with some of the precipitation events as well. I'm still seeing that in this later season here as well. And then the second one I'm going to touch on as well is heat stress, which I know we're all feeling as some of these days have been really climbing over that 28 degrees, and how that can impact your canola, especially when it is flowering. So I'm going to talk about excess moisture stress first. I have here, this is a photo from a really young field, and I just wanted to show some of those symptoms. So the plants will get stressed when, the soil that they're in is either waterlogged, so it's filling all of the pores here in the soil, or if there's actual flooding, right, you can see water then above the surface. But even if you can't see that water above the surface, right, evidently, if there's no air movement, etc., in the soil, because water is filling all those pores, it will stress those plants out. So symptoms that you can be seeing, especially in young, is kind of that yellowing of the canola. It's which you can see here in this photo. But then as we get a bit older, or it's affecting older plants, like you'll see more of the kind of purpling of the stems, etc. And it is tough sometimes to distinguish some of these symptoms versus nutrient deficiency. And they actually can usually be happening hand in hand. which I'll go through here, why we see that. And that's really because, right, when the water is filling all of those soil pores, there's no movement of water really. It's limiting that water uptake into the plant, and that's also limiting that oxygen uptake into the plant. And evidently, oxygen is really important as well as water as the plant's going through its life cycle, and especially with older plants too. They are using a lot of water, and so that's where you'll see kind of that purpling, because it's not able to take up as much as is needed because of these waterlogged or excess moisture conditions. So just that lack of oxygen being taken up by the plant's roots is going to affect all the plant systems, and that plant will really be in a stress state, which you'll be able to see the effects of after a few days for sure. So when we think about the soil, though, it's actually, rather than soil type definitely plays a factor in whether that soil will become really waterlogged or flooded, of course, as well as the amount of precipitation that you're receiving. But a really big factor is actually the internal drainage. So again, low-lying spots, very obvious, will be more prone to being saturated and having that excess moisture stress. So you might not see it across an entire field, plants exhibiting these symptoms, right? You might see in certain patches, kind of where that water is like running to or more concentrated in and being really waterlogged. So yeah, you can see this. The plant can experience it really at all growth stages, and it will experience it a bit differently, though, which I'll touch on in a second. But the main things that are happening is you're going to see that potential color change from stress, can also be from nutrient deficiencies. Even if the nutrients are there, it's just not having that movement of water and with those nutrients into the roots. There's no movement. There's no pockets for things to move through because it's all filled with water. And so you can have, nutrient deficiencies in crop. You can also, with the younger canola, especially depending where you're staying at, you can have smaller root system development because it's just doesn't have that oxygen to grow, etc. So stunted growth, and you will see stress bolting. So evidently with stunted growth, right, coming from a lot of, again, just not having oxygen and not having those nutrients potentially. But then what I do like to point out is that the plant will stress bolt after a period of stress because it is going to, even if it has just a couple of true leaves, it's really focused on, completing its life cycle and trying to produce seed, even if it's not going to be the amount of seed or the amount of pods that it normally would. It is just trying to complete its life cycle while experiencing the stress. So it will not be prioritizing at that point filling in leaves or really growing a lot more true leaves. So you're going to see really kind of thin leaves, and it's just going to focus on getting that stem elongated and then moving into those reproductive or seed focused stages. So it will, stress bolt and then move right into flowering rather than having taken the time, as you would see kind of in a not stressed crop, where it will have taken the time to really grow those large leaves and have that store of energy in those leaves, which is later really going to be used during the seed filling of the pods, right? And so that is why there's your stress bolting or this excess moisture stress can definitely affect yield, because that plant won't, if it's experienced the stress in those younger stages, it just won't have those stores necessarily that it can pull from if it moves right into stress bolting, flowering, and then seed production. That being said, though, plants do have internal systems, right? So they try and adapt to that excess moisture stress or that waterlogging, and usually can withstand about 3 to 7 days of subsequent excess moisture stress. So I'm going to talk a bit here about growth stages and the effects there. So here I have a photo of some stems which are potentially, showing nutrient deficiency or some excess moisture stress. So what's the difference if it's experiencing this at a younger stage versus at the flowering stages? So at the seedling or early vegetative growth stages, the plant will not have consumed as much soil water. So if it moves into that excess moisture stress, your soils may waterlog sooner, but that at that point there are still in these early stages lower oxygen demands. So you can see the plant really rebound if you have some heat and the soil dries out. It will be able to rebound and kind of really switch into filling out leaves and kind of recompensating for what it's lost there if it hasn't moved into stress bolting. And it'll really prioritize again root biomass and leaves as well, and just kind of uptake, etc. But if you see, if you're experiencing that excess moisture stress when the plants are larger or at that flowering stage, like I alluded to before, this is the time where it's using up a lot of water. It's really a lot of movement of water as those pods are forming and as the seeds are forming in the pods. But also at this point, right, there's a lot more, temperatures are higher, so the soil will be absorbing more water as well. But because the plants are photosynthesizing and respirating at such a high rate, this is when they're greater need. So if it's waterlogged, that water will not be moving and can definitely you're going to see that purpling, and it will be really, it will be quite stressed because it's just not having that movement when it's needed here at the most important time. But like I said, there is tolerance that it can recuperate. It has internal systems and will respond right to stress, especially if it's within that 3 to 7 day period. And in terms of tolerance for, specifically oil seeds, canola will do better under excess moisture or waterlogged conditions, right, than some of the other oil seeds such as sunflower or flax. It's just able to respond more quickly and bounce back after that if those conditions alleviate, but perhaps is not compensating as well as other crops, right? We see cereals can do, for example, can at times compensate better for sure than oil seeds. So that's kind of a touch on excess moisture and what you're seeing. So again, earlier stages, probably more of that yellowing and potentially coupled with nutrient deficiencies and stunted growth. Again, doing tests to see if there are nutrient deficiencies. Like you have to look at a couple points in your plant to ensure that, and then also as it moves on and it affects the later stages, right, it's going to turn to more of a purpling on the stem, etc. And that's kind of the indicators that that plant is being stressed by waterlogged or flooded conditions. So I'll move on to the next kind of abiotic stress, heat stress here. And we have a photo here from Lionel, which I'm going to talk about. And why are we seeing potentially some missing pods? So you can see here, there should be pods, and why are they not there? So heat stress. So heat stress is really when, you have those high daily temperatures that we're experiencing in a lot of areas of over 28 degrees Celsius and above. So what it's doing is, especially during time, so your canola is flowering, your flowers have opened, and they need to move from those flowers into pods. They need to be fertilized and move from those flowers into pods. What happens is that these high temperatures affect the fertility, and those canola flowers can actually abort and not move into pods. So they will have opened, but then they will not be replaced with a pod in that spot. So you will see those missing pods on the stems where flowers had bloomed but did not move into the next stage. So this can happen with, a sequential days over 28 degrees Celsius. And I have a map showing how many days that we've kind of hit in different areas for this. But I should mention that weather events such as having cloud cover, which can really reduce the amount of heat that's felt in the top of the canopy, or cooler temperatures at night as well, will bring relief to those canola crops experiencing heat stress with over 28 degrees, and can help a lot with protecting flowers from aborting. And then also you have on your stems a lot more flowers than will open, or a lot more flowers that will open that actually would move into pods. So there is a bit of a buffer there as well in terms of protecting yield. So things like I said, cloud cover, the decrease in temperature overnight, if it's, more of a flux, and then also having there are just extra canola flowers. These are all things that help, and the plant is able to help compensate for those higher temperatures that it's experiencing. So if you are walking through your field and you're noticing, at the top and especially middle stems of your canola, there are spaces that are missing that look like it's flowered already, but there are not pods. This can be an indication of that heat stress. And yeah, so just some things to be able to identify. Okay, so I'm going to move really quickly. Oh, here, I actually just wanted to point this out. So this is just until July 28th. And this is just showing some of the areas that have, in terms of number of days that have hit 28 degrees or above. And so potentially had some more severe heat stress. And but I will note that it's not adjusted for overnight temperatures, which again can help a lot with that crop resiliency. Okay, so I'm going to do a really quick run through here we've talked about some of the weather stresses, identifying them, what they look like in the field. Now I'm going to take a quick run through here of some of the canola diseases to take a look for that are going to be popping up potentially during August, especially here, that you can see. And just how to identify those is kind of the main focus. I'm going to do a quick run through here. So there's kind of 6 main ones, I think, to look for in your fields. And I love acronyms. Maybe this isn't the best acronym, but this is kind of the A, B, C's plus V of just diseases to be on the mind if you are in your field and see something weird, and can kind of run through these as a first stop in terms of identification. So alternary pod spot is first A, then aster yellows, blackleg, clubroot, sclerotinia, and then verticillium stripe. So I'm just going to show you some photos of what those look like, potential areas in the field, and yeah, this was done in collaboration with David Kaminsky, evidently the disease specialist. So let's do a quick run through here. Okay, so visual symptoms for alternaria pod spot. So if you're walking through and you're noticing some of these black, kind of dots on either pods that are filling or on the stem as well, this is going to be an indication potentially of alternaria pod spot. So this is more of a minor disease that we see in fields. It's not very prevalent, but it is found. So it's evident, especially in areas where there's been persistent rainfall. Yeah, potentially for sure from this season. If areas have become dry recently, it's much less likely that it will be present and seen. So really correlated with or really seen with those higher moisture conditions. Aster yellow. So here I have a photo. If you're looking kind of out on top of your canola and you see these weird kind of buds on the top, so you can see it really is very distinctive and stands out. This is deformed pods, but not because of heat stress. This is because of aster yellows. So whereas we saw in heat stress, you're going to have those missing pods or very small pods that have like died. Aster yellows will turn that pod from its seed focus or reproductive tissue, like that pod filling with seeds, actually into kind of like a false like leaf tissue. So it's going to have these weird misshapen false leaves where your flowers or pods should be. Also, lower on your plant, you may also have leaves that are discolored or kind of a red tinge. And just in terms of yield, impact on yield here, generally it's seen in small spots across the field and has very minimal impact. There may be just some spots around the field. And so, yeah, again, less of a concern. But if you're looking and don't know what it is, that is an indication of aster yellows. So here I have just a closer photos of this. So you can see it becomes kind of weird kind of leaf tissue. And I actually have here where it's showing, a leaf growing out of that. Okay, so in terms of blackleg, so visual symptoms you're going to be looking for on your leaves and in your earlier growth stages here, and then also on the stem as we get here into August. And so there's a couple of great photos here from the Canola Council showing, those kind of lesions or sores here on the stem, very indicative of blackleg. You can see the black spotting within that of the blackleg pycnidia. And then same thing on the leaf. Again, it's a kind of a circular lesion or sore. And then within that, the black dots. And so always recommend, though, if you are unsure if it is blackleg, to send a stem sample to a lab to confirm, because especially the next step would be to do a cross section during August here especially. And so actually to cut that stem and to take a look. So because within that stem, if you can see visual symptoms of blackleg, it'll be blackish color, kind of wedge shaped there, which I have a photo in a second. But if you're walking into a field, you're noticing that there are these lesions on the stems in the upper part of the canopy. Also look for signs of hail injury. This can go hand in hand. So usually will be on one side of the plant. And then again, to determine how severe your infection is, it's really key to do that cross section and actually cut the stem and do a cross section. So here I'm just showing a closer up picture of the lesions or sores that you can see. But then here I have an example of a cross section where it's been cut. And the Canola Council has a great severity rating scale where you can take a look to see where your infection falls in terms of that severity. Okay, and so next up, I just wanted to show this very quickly. We're going to get here into sclerotinia, but I wanted to show an example of where you can see a blackleg potential lesion here, very circular, versus your sclerotinia kind of watery damage. So happening on the both leaf, but different causes. Okay, so our C is for clubroot. Again, this is important that if you are suspecting clubroot or see clubroot, that you practice biosecurity measures. So it is soil-borne, so it can very easily spread right upon entering or exiting canola fields especially. So if it's present, it's most likely found at your field entry points or lower spots. And you can see it more in wetter years where it's going to really stress the plants because they have that impact on their root system. So you can see here a healthier root system versus ones impacted by clubroot galls. So you have to pull the plants to see them. The galls, it'll be on the roots, and they're very like deformed kind of club-like structures. Okay, so if you do find clubroot, we really encourage you to please contact us for instructions on sample collection and then next steps. Okay, second last here, sclerotinia. So for your visual symptoms that you're going to be seeing are on your stems and your leaves. So here I just have pulled this. This is not showing sclerotinia, but that it's when the leaves are dropping. It's when the flowers here are dropping and then are on the leaves and on the axils. So kind of these points, they'll get stuck there and you can have a sclerotinia infection then. And you'll have kind of these rotting or water stained lesions. You can also look at the on the soil floor there for these apothecia structures as well. And that'll give you an indication. So you're looking for, if you're looking out over a field, you're looking for lodged patches with prematurely ripened plants. So especially in low areas, it's good to go and take a closer look to see if there's sclerotinia there. There's a slight chance, right, that there are other causes because of that, but it generally can be a very good indication that there is sclerotinia there. But if lodging is generally throughout the field, right, less likely that it would be sclerotinia. Okay, so our last one here is verticillium stripe. So if you are seeing kind of this unilateral or specific areas of discoloration on the plant, so you can see this brown versus green, very obvious, alternating brown and green as you move up the stem and main branches. This is an indication of verticillium stripe infection. So like blackleg, again, the best way to confirm other than lab tests is with your stem cross section. And so take that at the base and identify, it'll have more of a grayish tinge than blackleg potentially, but it is very challenging to distinguish or to actually define if it was blackleg or verticillium. So always recommend sending a sample for testing, and potentially it can also even be both, having both infections as well. But again, blackleg will have that more distinctive black color tone usually versus verticillium will be more of a gray, and you can usually follow that up the stem and see the striping. Okay, so that is a whirlwind walkthrough of some of the stresses in the canola crop, this growing season. So here's my contact if there is, that should be 750 if there's any further questions. And with that though, I will hand it over to Lionel. Thank you.
Hey, Sonia, thanks. What we'll do is we'll get John's presentation and then we'll ask questions to both of you if that works.
Sounds good, thanks.
Okay, so take it away, John, with our insect update.
Okay, just give me a sec here to pull my presentation up. Can you guys see my presentation, Lionel?
I did, but maybe, yeah, there it is there. Just go
okay.
Yeah, show my
Cool.
screen now.
Good. Okay. So we'll switch gears.
Do the swap screen there, John. So we just.
Oh, yes.
Perfect.
Okay, very good. So yeah, we'll switch gears to talk about insects a little bit. And I'm going to focus in on actually 5 different insects that you could encounter late in the season. There's certainly other ones that you can and probably will see in a canola field. These are the 5 that if there was going to be economic damage in August, it's usually one of these 5 culprits. And so 2 of them are caterpillars, we've got grasshoppers, potentially late season flea beetles, and lygus bugs, a sap feeder. So we'll go over them in that order. So Bertha armyworm. No economic populations have been reported so far, so that's good news. But we don't want to be complacent. With Bertha armyworm, everything is tied to temperature regarding their stage development. And we had such a cool May and June that we weren't seeing the adults come out as early as we usually do. Our trap counts that we put up started peaking in late July this year. So I know there's been a bit of egg laying happening. We're probably still at the point where there's still a lot of young larvae. So it could be another week or two before you start seeing the older larvae. So it's something to keep an eye on. One of the things that can be tricky for crop scouts is Bertha armyworm has different color morphs. So you can see in the picture on the left, you can have black Bertha armyworms, you can have brown Bertha armyworms, they can be green, they can be kind of different shades of brown even. They will have some distinctive striping along the side, but that can be one of the tricky aspects of identifying Bertha armyworm. They do like to feed on the leaves. However, when the leaves start senescing or if there's very heavy defoliation, then they will move up onto pods. And the pod feeding really is what is highly economical, or what can be. Usually leaf feeding late in the season isn't highly consequential unless it's very severe, as when they're feeding directly on the pods. That's what you need to prevent if numbers are very high in a field. So I mentioned trap catches. We do have a network of pheromone-baited traps put up. They were set up in about mid-June this year. We delayed it for a week because it was such a cool start to the season. And the traps are actually just coming down this week. So they've been up for about 8 weeks now, starting in about mid-June. There were 82 traps up across the province. Now, the good news is 81 of the 82 traps are still in what we call the low risk category. So anything under 300 cumulative moths over our trapping period is considered low risk. When you get above 300, you move into what we call an uncertain risk category, meaning there could be some localized Bertha armyworm issues. It does not mean the field the trap is in is at high risk. It means there could be some fields in the region that need scouting and could have economical populations. The reason we don't want to put too much weight on what's happening in the field the trap is in, the traps only catch males. The females lay the eggs. The females are attracted to fields at a very specific stages. They like flowering fields, particularly when they're laying their eggs. So you could have a trap in a field that really is not at a opportune stage for females to lay eggs in, yet is catching a lot of males. So if you did have one of these traps in your fields and you did have a fair number of moths in it, it does not mean that field is at risk. It means scout fields in the region. And really the purpose of the trapping is to get people prioritizing scouting properly, not to make spray decisions. So the one trap that was into that uncertain risk zone was in the Killarney area. The rest are all well below 200, maybe with the exception of up in the Paw, there was one that's crept over 200. So moving on to diamondback moth, another caterpillar. This one's a little different. Bertha armyworm overwinters in Manitoba. Diamondback moth doesn't do it too well. I won't say that they don't. There's some good, at least anecdotal evidence based on what we've been catching in our traps that some probably did overwinter the past winter. However, most will end up getting blown in. So when we have damaging populations, it's because we've had a big movement of moths that have gotten blown in by south winds and shown up in Manitoba. So we also trap for these. The other big difference between diamondback moth and Bertha armyworm, Bertha armyworm has one cycle per year. Diamondback moth has 3 or sometimes 4 cycles per year, depending on the temperature. We got off to a cooler start. We're making up for it a bit now. We'll have minimum 3 generations this year, possibly a 4th generation. We're probably wrapping up generation 2 right now, going into generation 3. So far, there's been no economic populations reported. For that first generation, which was occurring in late June, early July as adults, we really didn't have any economic populations. In fact, by early July, we were kind of wrapping up that first cycle, and the larvae became very hard to find. Prior to that, you could find them if you were in canola fields, but not at huge levels. Cycle 2, I would say maybe not even as big as generation 1. Sometimes what will happen is populations will actually go down over the course of the generations. Other years, they go up. Sometimes they plateau. It doesn't mean because we've got 4 cycles, they're going to keep building and building and building and building. Sometimes that happens. Other times, either weather or natural enemies or a combination of events will actually bring down the levels between generations. So far, no economic levels. If anybody is seeing any big populations of them, please let me know. I try to track where we're seeing higher levels, but so far, nobody's been reporting any big levels. And we noticed a huge difference between this year and last year when we were doing cabbage seed pod weevil survey. Last year, not that this is a great way to scout for them, but when we were sweeping for cabbage seed pod weevil, sometimes there would be extremely high numbers of diamondback moth larvae in our nets when we would do our 25 sweeps. This year, just a trickle of what things were from last year. So that's good. The traps that we put up, we set the traps up in early May. We keep them up through May and June. We had 92 traps up across the province. And here's the highest couple counts in each of the regions. And you can see the western part of Manitoba. There was very little in the traps. So this is once again about an 8-week period. And our highest count in western Manitoba was 33 up by the paw. So divide that by 8 and you're just a few moths per trap per week, which isn't highly alarming. A bit more when we go further east, especially the Interlake region, eastern part of the province, trap counts were higher. So what seemed to have happened is in early and mid-June, we noticed the counts really spike in the traps. And then in late June, the levels went down. So some of the south winds in early June and mid-June seem to have brought some bigger populations, more specifically into the eastern part of Manitoba, eastern Interlake, eastern part of the central region. That's where the moths got brought in and dumped, it seems. That happened in early and mid-June. Then the adults died off. We went through that first cycle. But again, we really didn't get the high larval numbers as a result. A couple reasons. Weather could be one. We had a lot of rain in May and June, as most of you are aware. Rain can be a natural enemy of diamondback moth, especially for the very young larvae. If they're very young, they're a very delicate young larva, and they can easily get washed off of plants in a heavy pounding rainstorm, drowned on the soil, or become more vulnerable to predation when they're on the soil. So that's one possibility. There's also predation and parasitism that can help keep levels low as well. But the weather certainly wouldn't have been favorable for their populations to really take off, given the May and June that we had when that first cycle arrived. And just an update too on what you want to be looking for late in the season. They will feed on buds, flowers, leaves, pods, but just like Bertha armyworm, they'll probably stick to the leaves quite a bit if there's a lot of green leafy material. But once the plants start dropping those leaves, they will move up onto pods, and you will see them feeding on the pods. That really is where they can be most economical. The picture on the right here shows the cocoons of some of them on some of the pods. So do keep an eye on if there's much pod feeding happening. At this point in the season, I'm not seeing any big levels. I'm not going to predict that we're going to see a lot of diamondback moth feeding, but just something else to keep an eye on when you're scouting your canola late in the season. And if you need more information on how to scout diamondback moth, thresholds, or how to identify them, we have a fact sheet on them on our website. It was updated this past April, so go to that if you need more information. So insect number 3, grasshoppers. So I'll just start by mentioning in canola, we've got lots of species of grasshoppers in Manitoba. If you are seeing grasshoppers in canola, it's probably going to be either two-striped grasshopper, which you see on the upper left of the screen, or possibly migratory grasshopper down below here. These are 2 of our potential 4 pest species in the province. We've got over 80 different types of grasshoppers. There's 4 that can be pests. 2 of them that you may see in canola. This third one here, clue-wing grasshopper, it's primarily a grass feeder. I have seen them in canola before, but not feeding. And in fact, I got an interesting call from an agronomist a couple of years ago where they were seeing a lot of grasshoppers in a canola field, but they weren't feeding, and they were wondering what is going on and should we be spraying because there's a lot of them. The day or 2 later, they had moved out of the field and didn't do much feeding. What had happened was the pasture near the field had dried up. It was a very dry year a couple years ago. A pasture near the field was defoliated and dried up. They were feeding in there. They moved into the canola, which was next to the pasture, and it wasn't a host crop for them. So even though they were there for a day or 2, they just kept moving and didn't touch the canola. So good to know your grasshopper species. If it's got these chocolatey brown dots on the wings, it's clear winged, 2 stripes going down the wings and thorax, black dots. Clear wing probably won't feed on the canola. If the 2 stripes start behind the eye and go to the back of the body, that's 2-striped grasshopper. They're a generalist feeder. They will feed on canola. They're the one you need to keep an eye on. And just another comment on grasshoppers in canola. Canola is not usually their first choice of things to feed on. They will feed on it, definitely. Often with grasshoppers in canola, they're moving in when other crops have matured, or maybe a ditch has been cut or something like that. It can be where they start out if that's where the eggs are hatching, but often they're moving in, and you do often get these edge effects where they've moved in from, say, a wheat field across the road, a grassy ditch, or some other area, and you've got a very heavy edge effect. So if you're scouting canola and you're walking into the field and you notice a lot of grasshopper activity and movement, I would encourage you, if it's easy enough to walk into the field, go a little ways in and just see if the population thins out. Sometimes you do get these heavy edge effects, and in that case, an edge treatment would be all you need to do. On a positive note, I'm once again noticing a lot of bee flies and a lot of blister beetles this year. So bee flies, they almost look like bumblebees. You'll see a big, long proboscis on the one that is a grasshopper egg specialist as a juvenile. So this one in my photo here is called the grasshopper bee fly. At its young stage, eats nothing but grasshopper eggs, which look like little rice grains. So I've been seeing a lot of them around this year, more than I normally would be seeing. And also blister beetles, if they're black or gray, they belong to a group called Epicata, and their larvae also are grasshopper egg specialists. So these things are abundant this year because over the past few years, there's been a lot of food around for them. So that's a good sign. And also regarding grasshoppers, they don't do as well in very wet, damp years, and especially cool, damp, wet years for a few reasons. They are definitely slower in their development this year than last year. Last year, I was seeing adult grasshoppers by the end of June. It was well into July this year when we were seeing adult grasshoppers. I saw my first ones during our diagnostic school this year. And just out this week, doing a little bit of sweeping in the ditches, is still predominantly juveniles. There's a lot more, at least 3/4 of what I was catching or more in some areas was still juveniles instead of adult grasshoppers. So they're still getting their wings. They've been delayed a bit because of the cooler start. So that will slow down their feeding a little bit. They will become adults soon. Also, in very damp years, you get more of a fungal pathogen that makes them go to the top of the plants and cling to the plants and die there. We're starting to see a little bit of that in the province. So hopefully that helps out a bit as well. And if you do need more information on grasshoppers, we do have a fact sheet on our website that covers all of our pest species and a few other ones. There's also this grasshopper identification and control methods guide. It might be hard to get hard copies of it, but there is a link where you can get an online version, and it has a lot of very good information on our pest species, as well as a lot of the non-pest grasshoppers, in case you're trying to figure out if what you're seeing is a harmful grasshopper or one you don't need to worry about. So transitioning to flea beetles late in the season. So flea beetles, even though you see the adults twice, they have one generation per year, but the adults are there at 2 different times. You get the adults in through late July through into September. So they're the adults that are going to be emerging from all the eggs that were laid back in May and June. They're going to be coming out as adults late in the season. They're going to overwinter as adults. And those will be the exact same flea beetles that are feeding next spring. And they lay their eggs and the cycle continues. So one generation, but adults are present late summer, early spring. So you will be starting to see flea beetles coming out and feeding on the canola as it's getting into the podding stages. A question I often get asked is how many flea beetles is too many? So is a situation like this in my photo going to be economical? And there's only been one study where they've tried to answer that question. And here's the results anyway. So this was a paper published in 2012. And what they did in this study was they were caging flea beetles on canola plants and measuring their impact on yield. And they really weren't able to develop an economic threshold because they found that even when they had numbers greater than 100 per plant, and for some cultivars greater than 350 per plant, they still didn't get economic yield loss. So I'm not going to suggest that you'll never get economic yield loss from late season flea beetles. You kind of have to use your judgment on this one. I definitely have seen and had photos sent to me of situations where the flea beetles were so thick that you had tremendous pod shattering and they were eating right into the pods. I know there are situations where late season flea beetles can be and are economical, and treatment probably is a good idea. But the other message, though, that's worth stressing is that it takes a lot of flea beetles per plant late in the season to do economic damage. So that picture, I'll go back to the previous picture. Keep an eye on how much damage is happening to pods. This may not be an economic situation. Keep an eye on things. It takes a lot of flea beetles per plant to make things economical. Also, you do have to consider pre-harvest intervals, things like that, when you're making these decisions. So to my final insect, lygus bugs. Luckily, so far, I haven't had any reports of any big numbers. For lygus bugs, they're quick little insects that feed on the sap of buds, flowers, young seeds. They like the new growth on the plants, that more high protein material. So, like I said, they'll feed on buds, flowers quite easily. Also, the very young seeds, once the seeds start to firm up, they'll probably lose interest and move looking for other host plants to feed on. So when you've got a lot of young pods with lush seeds that are still quite juicy, that's when you need to keep an eye on ligus levels. So you would use a sweep net to do that. You really can't figure out if you've got a lot of ligus bug without a sweep net. There's no other easy way. And I appreciate it does get really hard to sweep canola when you start getting into those early podding stages, because the crop, especially if it's tall, is hard to walk through. It's hard to sweep through. But unfortunately, there is no easier way. So do your best, do some sweeping. The threshold for ligus bug in canola has been updated. The publication actually just came out earlier this year, but we've been using these thresholds for a few years now. So the revised threshold is 20 to 30 ligus bugs per 10 sweeps. So that's what you would want to use. If it's a very dry year, you could drop that down to 10. This hasn't been a dry year. If the plants are drought stressed, 20 per 10 sweeps is probably a more appropriate threshold. A year like this, 30 would be a good number to use per 10 sweeps. One of the things I'll caution you on, though, is low levels of ligus bugs can actually enhance yield, which might seem like a really strange concept for a lot of people. The thinking is often that it's either a bad or a good insect, but Sonia already mentioned that canola produces a lot more flowers than it does pods. So flower feeding and bud feeding, the plant can compensate for that quite well. Really, it's the feeding to the pods that is detrimental. But the study that Carcamo et al. Did, they found that at low abundances, so under about 17 ligus in 10 sweeps, at times they even got increased yields compared to their control plots. So what was probably happening there was the ligus feeding was stimulating the overcompensation for the feeding that was done. Then eventually you will reach a point where the plants aren't overcompensating, and you'll reach a point where there's actually economic damage. But I guess the main message here is don't make the assumption because our canola is high in price that we want to use a lower threshold. One of the reasons that the old threshold had to be updated was when the price of canola went up, people were taking our previous threshold, which was much lower, and they were trying to extrapolate and say, well, if the threshold was done when canola was this price and the price has doubled, it should be half the level. But that line of thinking does not work in this case because you reach a point where ligus bug just isn't causing yield loss. And so people were spraying at incredibly low levels of ligus bug, 5 or 10 per 10 sweeps. People were spraying fields. And we now know situations like that really aren't economical. So use this threshold here, 20 to 30 per 10 sweeps. Good growing conditions, again, 30 per 10 sweeps is what you'd want to use. Once the seeds start to firm up and the ligus bugs can't pierce them anymore, you don't have to worry about them. Again, they will probably start moving out of the field looking for other host plants like sunflowers and later alfalfa, things like that to feed on. If you're looking for more information on ligus bugs, we do have a fact sheet on our website that covers ligus bugs in canola, alfalfa, beans, sunflowers, and other crops. So check that out if you need more information on ligus bugs. Also, regarding fact sheets on insects, this is a page you might want to bookmark if you are looking for information on insect scouting, management, thresholds, etc. This is our Manitoba Agriculture insect page. It basically lists all the fact sheets that we have, and we've got some beneficial insects, field crop insects, horde insects, etc. So any of these links that you click on will be a fact sheet on that particular insect. So something you could go to for information if you need to. And also, if you're looking for information on what we're finding in our monitoring programs or what is happening currently with insects in your region, we produce a weekly Manitoba crop pest update. It usually comes out every Thursday afternoon. It might be Friday morning this week because we're at Port Diagnostic School tomorrow. But this will give you a summary of what we're seeing in our monitoring programs and what is currently happening across the province for insects, weeds, and diseases. So you can check that out for more information as well. So I probably better end with that and leave room for questions.
Okay, thanks, John. A lot of good information, and thanks for putting up the information on the different links to those pages. A couple of questions have come in. First one, I guess, would be for Sonia. You had mentioned regarding temperature-wise, so is 28 kind of the temperature where we can see where the crop is going to be stressed?
Hi, Lionel. Yeah. So, and it's not necessarily just having kind of a one-off day of over 28 necessarily, right? It's having, definitely having a couple of those days back to back. And then if that overnight temperature, remains higher, and we don't have as much of a dip, that those plants just won't have that time to recover. So, but yeah, 28 is usually the kind of starting threshold to look at.
Okay, and just to continue on with a bit of the weather, will water stress increase chances of diseases like sclerotinia or blackleg?
Yes, definitely. Especially, higher moisture year for sclerotinia, especially. So again, just really important to be out there and scouting, because this year we'll definitely already seen more disease incidents for sure than some of the drier years here.
Okay, and John, I think you might have answered this one. Has the grasshopper population been increasing with the recent weather?
Well, it won't be increasing because they have one cycle or generation per year. The eggs are all laid for our pest species. The eggs are all laid the previous year in August and September mainly. So what hatches out in May and June is what you've got for the season. No new hatch will happen in after about, say, late June. What does happen is the grasshoppers get bigger, especially when we start getting some warmer weather, and they start growing quicker and they become more noticeable. So people will start noticing the grasshoppers more as they start getting into those adult stages. Until they become adults, they can't fly, they can just hop. Especially when they're small, they're not even hopping as much. So they just don't get noticed as much when they're in their early instar nymph stages. But again, as they do get bigger, you will start noticing them a bit more, and they'll be more mobile. But as far as numbers increasing, again, it's a fixed number that was determined back last, I guess a fixed maximum number that was determined last late summer.
Okay, some good points there. Just going to go to the crop scouting panel now and continue on with questions. And this one is for you, John. I sent you this picture the other day here. I was just wondering if you can maybe explain. Some people are seeing some kind of striping, almost like a skimming of the leaf tissue off the leaves. What do you think is causing this?
Yeah, so in this case, you'll notice that they're pretty thick white lines or streaks on the plant. So when they're thick streaks like that, it's most likely cereal leaf beetle. In this case, when you have no insect to see associated with it, the other insect that'll make little white streaks on cereal leaves is thrips, but those are really narrow streaks. Sometimes you get lots of them that merge together. In this case, though, big streaks, that'll be cereal leaf beetle. So cereal leaf beetle, the larvae would have been what made these streaks. The adults will actually feed right through the leaves and make little narrow holes, but they're feeding right through the leaf. The larvae just feed on the upper surface, and they leave these big streaks to them. Usually you find the larva in June and maybe into early July. This year, possibly into mid to late July. But by now, usually the larvae have all dropped to the ground to pupate, leaving just the scarring material behind. So cereal leaf beetle, it's something that usually isn't an economic problem here. Very noticeable when you see this. Cereal leaf beetle is very, very heavily managed by a parasitic wasp called Tetrastichus julis, which was purposely introduced into Manitoba over a several year period right after we found cereal leaf beetle in the province. Tetrastichus julis, it keys in. Cereal leaf beetle larvae have what they call a fecal shield. They cover themselves in their own poop, basically, to make themselves distasteful to other things. Seems to work. But this parasitic wasp can smell some of the fragrance from the fecal shield, and it's very good at detecting these cereal leaf beetle larvae and parasitizing them. So it's been keeping them in check for the most part across Manitoba.
Okay, good. Thanks, John. The next one. Everybody's been looking at their canola fields lately, and we see this every year. And I just thought maybe you might want to maybe address that.
Okay, so yeah, curled pods. So the most common cause of that is actually thrips. So thrips are very tiny insects. To find them, I would suggest tap your plants over a white piece of cardboard or a tray, and you'll see these little. They're small. They're long insects, but they're really tiny. But they're much longer than they are wide. Very quick, and they'll run around. They have what we call rasping and sucking mouth parts. They'll get onto a pod, and often they're feeding preferentially on the upper surface of the pod with their rasping mouth part. So they're rasping at the pod and feeding on the juices that come out. They don't feed right through, so they're not going to be a problem to the seeds. But the pod will start growing really funny when the upper surface specifically has been fed on, and it starts curling like a curly fry. So you get these curled pods. That's thrips. Usually not worth worrying about. It's very rare that you would see this at economic levels. Usually it's very noticeable, but usually not economical.
Yeah, I know I had producers wondering if there was some kind of chemical issue that it was happening and it just took longer for it to outgrow it. But thrips is what you've been calling it for years here, I think. So that's
Yes.
good. Thanks. Okay, I'm going to just skip to a few slides here. Maybe I should just, I'm not sure if Anne is on today or not. Lori, is Anne on?
No, I don't see Anne on.
Okay, I'll maybe just address this. I think I seen this last year and I seen it again this year, and what's happening to the bottom of the heads. And you see this when plants are under stress. They sometimes abort some of the spikelets, and that's what's happening on this wheat head. The bottom spikelets there where the arrow's pointing at, basically just the plant is aborting them because whether in this case it was because it was on a kind of a little bit of a hill that's starting to dry and a little lighter land, so we're starting to notice that. So if you're seeing some of that stuff happening in your cereal crops, it's just the plant looking out for the ones that are going to make it, and the ones that aren't, they're aborting them. So you'll see that quite often. Okay, a little information. This came out in the crop report that was sent out yesterday. So I thought this was good to see, just kind of a comparison of acres from last year to this year. And you look at across the board there, I was, when I seen the wheat, definitely I thought the acres were down this year, maybe not as much as I thought. Canola acres about the same. Soybeans down. What surprised me probably the most when I looked at this was the oats acres, probably doubled again from last year. So that'll be interesting to see. And field peas up again, and the dry beans as well. So and a big drop in sunflowers. So just a few things that I noticed from the report that was put out from crop insurance, and this is about 95 to 97% of the information they've compiled so far already. So pretty close to being what we're going to see at the end of the year. Another thing that's going to be coming out on the crop report from now on to the end of the year here is how the crop is looking throughout the different regions. And right now, the majority of the crop is in good shape. Some areas are starting to get a little bit dry. Maybe missed a little bits of the rains there, and you can see, but they're maybe in the fair range. But the majority of the crop is still in good condition. There's still some tours happening with the diversification centers. The Passaic tour is today. MCDC in Carberry is on August the 7th, and PCDF in Roblin is on August the 8th. So if you missed the one in Melita or you're missing the one today, there's still 2 more to go to. So if you're interested in some of the research that's happening, definitely a good opportunity to see and hear a lot of the speakers that are on CropTalk a lot of times. And there's just the contact information of the diversification centers if you want to pre-register for the 2 remaining ones. Manitoba Hay Listing Service. Looks like there's a lot of bales out there right now. So I would tell anybody, if you're looking at marketing hay, definitely there's a good opportunity to advertise it on the Manitoba Hay Listing Service. Crop residue burning. Again, if you're going to be looking at doing burning, you're needing to keep an eye on that as well. So making sure we are in a burning day or not. So keep your eyes on that website as well. The MASC service centers, there's their numbers and locations. So if you got any questions regarding, your crop, if you have any questions regarding seeded acreage, whether it be unseeded, definitely give them a call and get some more information. And I think that's it for this week. So I'd like to thank everybody for attending, and join us next week, August the 7th, for the next edition of CropTalk. And there's our contact information. Thanks for attending.